I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, one of those predictable days where nothing remarkable happens. I was sorting through the usual clutter on the kitchen counter when my eyes fell on the phone bill. I'm not a suspicious guy by nature, and Linda had never given me any reason to doubt her. But when you've been together as long as we had, you start to notice patterns, familiar rhythms in each other's lives. The phone bill was a small disturbance, like the first whisper of a storm. A particular number showed up repeatedly, more often than any of our friends or even work contacts. It had a Virginia area code, one I couldn't place with anyone we knew. At first, I shrugged it off. We both had our networks, friends from college, family out of state. But this number kept showing up month after month, and Linda's explanations didn't quite add up. When I casually mentioned it one evening, she laughed it off, claiming it was an old college friend she was helping through a tough time. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, lurking in the back of my mind, refusing to let go. I knew Linda was private, she valued her independence. But recently, that independence felt more like distance. She had started going out for work meetings more frequently and returning home later than usual. The old warmth that used to fill the room when she walked in seemed dimmed, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Even when she was there, she wasn't really there, more absorbed in her phone or her thoughts. I chalked it up to work stress at first. We all have those phases, right? I waited, and soon enough, an opportunity presented itself. One Saturday, Linda said she needed to run some errands. Her phone, usually glued to her hand, was left behind, lighting up the counter as she pulled out of the driveway. My hands itched to reach for it, to check if that Virginia number was still around. But I hesitated. It felt wrong, like breaking some unspoken pact of trust. I convinced myself that maybe she'd just forgotten it, maybe it was nothing at all. Then, 2 minutes later, a message popped up. It was from the Virginia number. "Miss you already," it said, accompanied by a winking emoji. I could almost hear her voice in my head, laughing, brushing it off as some innocent joke. But the sinking feeling in my chest told me otherwise. This wasn't a joke. I stood there, staring at the screen, my heart thudding so loud I was sure she'd hear it the moment she stepped back inside. The message seemed to mock me, daring me to dig deeper. When she got back, I didn't say anything. I forced myself to act normal, as though the last 30 minutes hadn't happened. But that night, lying awake beside her, I couldn't shake the gnawing ache of suspicion. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it or that I was overreacting, but doubt had planted itself firmly in my mind, and there was no uprooting it now. Over the next few days, I started piecing things together. I'd notice little things, how she'd angle her phone away from me, the way she'd get defensive if I asked too many questions about her day. I'd catch her smiling at her screen or typing something quickly before tucking her phone away as if she'd been caught red-handed. These signs, once innocent quirks, now felt like proof of something sinister, something that had been hiding in plain sight. One evening, I decided to test her. We were out to dinner, a quiet place we both loved. It had been a while since we'd done anything together, and I wanted to believe that whatever was going on was just a rough patch. After we ordered, I casually mentioned her phone. I joked about how she was always so attached to it, wondering if she'd survive a weekend without it. She laughed it off, but I could see the flash of panic in her eyes, just for a second, before she composed herself. "Maybe I should take a break from it," she replied with a smile, though her hands were already reaching for her bag as if to reassure herself it was still there. I couldn't stand it anymore. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I made up my mind. I waited until I heard her breathing settle into that deep, peaceful rhythm she had when she was asleep. Then, heart pounding, I crept over to her side of the bed and lifted her phone from the nightstand. She'd set it on Do Not Disturb, and sure enough, the Virginia number's messages popped up in her notifications. I opened them, scrolling through conversations that turned my stomach. They were filled with plans, jokes, and affectionate words. He called her beautiful, told her he couldn't wait to see her. She replied in kind, as though he was some missing piece in her life that she'd finally found. I felt like an intruder in my own marriage, standing there, reading these words that didn't belong between us. It was a strange feeling, like watching my life through a stranger's eyes. The Linda I knew, the woman who'd promised to love me forever, was nowhere in those messages. Instead, there was a version of her that had hidden herself away, building a separate life with someone else. In the days that followed, I played my part perfectly. I went to work, kept up with our friends, smiled at her when she was around. But inside, I was seething, barely holding back the hurt and the anger that simmered beneath the surface. I felt betrayed, like I'd been living in a lie, and I couldn't just confront her, not yet. I wanted to know everything before I let her know what I knew. That's when I started gathering evidence. I combed through her call history, her emails, anything that would confirm what I'd seen that night. It was all there, right under my nose, and yet she'd been so careful, hiding her deception under layers of ordinary routine. The Virginia number, the fake work trips, even the expenses on her credit card, everything pointed to one conclusion. As our anniversary approached, I knew what I had to do. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for us to reconnect. She'd planned it, booked the cabin, and even arranged for my sister to watch the kids. But I had a different plan. This wasn't going to be a celebration. It was going to be a reckoning. On the morning of our departure, I watched her pack, her face glowing with anticipation. She thought I was none the wiser, that I was blissfully unaware of the secret she was keeping. But I'd waited long enough, and now, it was time to see just how much she could lie right to my face. We left for the cabin on Friday morning. It was about a 3-hour drive, and Linda was in high spirits, talking about how much she was looking forward to a weekend away, just the two of us. I sat quietly, responding when necessary but mostly letting her talk. The act was exhausting, and every word she said felt hollow, like a performance meant to fool me. I looked at her hands on the wheel, the same hands that used to squeeze mine during long drives. I used to find comfort in her presence, but now her laughter sounded forced, and her gaze felt like it was a million miles away. The cabin was in the woods, a place we'd rented before when we were younger, back when life was simpler. As we pulled up, I tried to shake off the memories, but they flooded back, making it hard to breathe. I remembered our first weekend there, snowed in during a blizzard, laughing over burnt hot chocolate and playing board games by candlelight. Now, all I could feel was a bitter taste, knowing that those memories didn't mean the same to her anymore. Once we unpacked, Linda suggested going for a hike to clear our heads. I could tell she sensed the tension, but I didn't give her any explanation. We walked in silence along the narrow path that cut through the woods, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the crunch of twigs under our boots. At one point, she stopped, pointing out a hawk circling high above us. "Look at that," she said, awe in her voice. "Isn't it beautiful?" I followed her gaze, watching the hawk as it soared effortlessly, its sharp eyes scanning the ground below. It reminded me of myself these last few weeks, constantly watching, constantly waiting, preparing to strike. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything, afraid my voice would betray the storm brewing inside me. That evening, we made dinner together, a ritual we'd always enjoyed. She poured us both a glass of wine, her cheeks flushed, eyes shining in the soft glow of the kitchen lights. I watched her as she moved, graceful and familiar, yet somehow now a stranger. She didn't know I was studying her, dissecting every smile, every word, looking for signs of deceit. How had I missed it for so long? How had she managed to keep this secret without a hint of remorse or regret? After dinner, we settled by the fireplace. She leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, I almost let myself believe everything was normal. But then I remembered the messages, the calls, the lies, and the anger surged back with a vengeance. I shifted, making her lift her head, and she looked at me, a question in her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, as though she were genuinely concerned. "You've been quiet since we got here." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, planning for. But now that it was here, the words were caught in my throat. I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself that I'd prepared for this. I had to play it right. "You tell me, Linda," I replied, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Why don't you tell me what's wrong?" She blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," I said, the anger slipping through despite my efforts to control it. "Don't pretend like you don't know." I watched her face carefully, looking for any crack, any sign that she'd admit it right then and there. But she just looked at me, bewildered, her brow furrowed. "Tom, I don't understand." She reached for my hand, but I pulled it away, unable to stand her touch. "What's going on?" I could see her trying to piece together what I was saying, trying to figure out how much I knew. For a second, a flash of something, fear, maybe guilt, crossed her face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of hurt that almost made me second-guess myself. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Linda?" I asked, my voice low. "Do you think I haven't noticed the late nights, the texts, the phone calls from Virginia?" She paled, her eyes widening. There it was, the confirmation I needed. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, and I could see the gears turning in her head as she tried to come up with a plausible explanation. But I wasn't about to let her twist the truth anymore. "Don't bother trying to lie," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "I know everything. I know about him. I know about the messages, the secret meetings. I know." Her mouth closed, her jaw clenching. For a moment, she looked like she might fight it, deny everything. But then, as though a switch had flipped, her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Tom." I waited, feeling the weight of her words sink in. I had imagined this moment so many times, thought about how I'd feel, what I'd say, but now that it was here, all I felt was emptiness. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" She lowered her hands, looking at me with eyes that were suddenly tired, defeated. "I don't know. I was lonely, maybe. I felt like we'd lost each other somewhere along the way." Her words hit me like a slap. Here it was, the classic excuse. The "I was lonely" line, as if that somehow justified tearing apart the life we'd built together. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her understand the depth of her betrayal, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So, because you felt lonely," I said, barely containing my anger, "you thought it was okay to betray me? To lie to my face for months, maybe years?" She flinched, but I didn't care. She deserved to feel every ounce of pain that I was feeling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice cracking. I thought it would just be a phase. That maybe it would make things better between us. I didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and foreign. "Didn't mean to hurt me? You didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated, incredulous. "Linda, you destroyed everything. You destroyed us." She sat in silence, her head bowed, and for the first time, I saw her for who she truly was, a stranger, someone I couldn't recognize. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, was gone, replaced by someone who had willingly torn our lives apart without a second thought. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me. I walked to the window, looking out into the darkness, trying to collect my thoughts, to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave, to pack up and drive away without looking back. But another part of me, a darker part, wanted her to feel the pain I felt, to understand what she had done. When I finally turned back to face her, she was looking at me, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, I almost felt pity, almost wanted to comfort her. But the anger and betrayal ran too deep. "I don't want your apology," I said, my voice steely. "Apologies don't fix anything. They don't undo what you've done. You made a choice, and now you're going to live with it." Her lip trembled, but she stayed silent, perhaps realizing that there was nothing left to say. I walked past her, not sparing her a second glance, heading to the small guest room down the hall. I didn't want to be near her, didn't want to hear her excuses or feel her presence. I closed the door, locking her out and shutting off the light. In the darkness, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, letting the anger and the pain consume me. Tomorrow, I'd decide what to do. Tomorrow, I'd confront her again, not for answers but for the satisfaction of seeing her face as I took control of our future. For tonight, though, I'd let myself mourn the life I thought we had, the life she had taken from me in the name of loneliness. The next morning was cold and overcast, a stark contrast to the warmth of the cabin and the life we'd once shared. I could hear Linda moving around in the kitchen, probably hoping to make some kind of peace offering, coffee, breakfast, something that would patch over the raw edges of what she'd admitted last night. But I didn't want her coffee or breakfast. I wanted the truth, and I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. I took a moment to collect myself before heading out to face her. It felt like donning armor, a necessary preparation for what I was about to do. When I walked into the kitchen, she looked up, her face pale and puffy from a night of crying. She had 2 mugs of coffee ready on the table, but I ignored them, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her without a word. She took a shaky breath, reaching for the coffee. Her hand trembled, and I felt a small, vindictive satisfaction at her obvious discomfort. "Tom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to get this far. I thought I could keep it separate, that it wouldn't affect us." I almost laughed. The sheer absurdity of her words filled me with a bitter amusement. Keep it separate. Like some dirty little secret she could hide in a drawer when she was home with me. She truly had no idea how deep this betrayal cut. "Keep it separate," I repeated, letting the words linger, feeling the weight of their emptiness. "Linda, you didn't just cheat. You tore apart everything we built. You lied to me, every single day, every time you looked me in the eyes. How do you separate that?" She swallowed hard, looking away, but I didn't let her escape. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice steely. "A few months," she said, staring down at her hands. Maybe 6 months." Her voice wavered as if she hadn't even realized how much time had passed. 6 months. Half a year of lies and secrecy. Half a year of pretending. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to shout. The anger was a hot, living thing inside me, and I could feel it clawing its way to the surface. "And who is he?" I asked, my voice cold and unfeeling. She hesitated, glancing at me as if afraid to reveal too much. "Just, someone from work. We met on a business trip, and things just happened." "Things just happened?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Like you tripped and fell into his arms." She closed her eyes, wincing, and I knew my words were cutting deep. But I didn't care. She deserved every bit of the pain I was feeling, every ounce of the bitterness and betrayal that had hollowed me out from the inside. "Did you love him?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I even wanted the answer. She shook her head, her voice cracking. "No, Tom. I swear, it wasn't about love. It was. I don't even know what it was. A distraction. An escape." She looked up, her eyes pleading with me to understand. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I never stopped loving you." "Funny," I said, leaning back in my chair, "because you have a pretty strange way of showing love, Linda. Sneaking around behind my back, whispering sweet nothings to someone else while you're supposed to be committed to me." Is that love to you? She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, maybe pity, maybe some leftover empathy. But then I remembered all the nights she'd come home late, all the times she'd smiled at me with a secret hidden in her heart, and the pity vanished, replaced by cold, unrelenting anger. So what happens now? She asked after a long silence, her voice barely a whisper. I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but, do we just throw it all away? Throw it all away? I repeated, incredulous. Linda, you threw it away the minute you chose him over us. The moment you decided that I wasn't enough for you. She looked down, shame flooding her features. Please, Tom. Can't we try to work through this? For the kids, if nothing else. There it was, the last, desperate plea. The one that was supposed to make me reconsider, to pull at my heartstrings, to make me second-guess my decision. But I had thought of the kids already. I'd spent long nights worrying about what this would mean for them, how it would tear their lives apart. But I couldn't ignore what Linda had done. I couldn't pretend that we were still the family we once were. The kids deserve better than this, I said, my voice hard. They deserve parents who respect each other, who don't lie and cheat and betray. They deserve a father who isn't a fool. She flinched, and for a moment, I saw the cracks in her mask, the guilt, the regret. But it was too little, too late. I wasn't going to let her try to wriggle out of this, to minimize what she'd done. What were you planning to do? I asked, leaning forward. Keep seeing him? Keep lying to me? Or were you just waiting for me to find out so you wouldn't have to make a decision? She shook her head, her hands twisting in her lap. I didn't know, Tom. I didn't have a plan. I got in too deep, and I couldn't see a way out. A way out? I scoffed. Linda, there was always a way out. You could have talked to me, been honest with me. But instead, you chose the coward's way. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw real tears streaming down her cheeks. I knew those tears weren't just for me, they were for herself, for the realization of what she'd lost. But that didn't move me. Not anymore. I stood up, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. I'm going for a walk, I said, grabbing my jacket. I need some space to think. She nodded, not saying a word, and I could feel her eyes on me as I left the cabin, the door closing behind me with a finality that echoed through the silent woods. The air outside was cold, sharp, a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension in the cabin. I walked along the narrow path that led through the woods, my footsteps crunching over fallen leaves, my mind a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and hurt. How had it come to this? How had I let myself believe that we were happy, that she was content? I felt like a fool, like I'd been living in a dream while reality had crumbled around me. As I walked, I started to think about what life would be like without her. I'd never considered it before, not seriously. Linda and I had been together for so long that she felt like an extension of myself, a part of my identity. But now, faced with her betrayal, I realized that I could no longer see her the same way. I couldn't go back, couldn't unsee the messages, the lies, the truth she'd hidden from me. After an hour, I made my way back to the cabin, my mind clearer, my resolve stronger. When I stepped inside, Linda was sitting at the table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked up as I entered, hope flickering in her eyes, but I met her gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. I've made my decision, I said, my voice steady. We're done, Linda. There's no coming back from this. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had settled on them. She nodded, a small, defeated motion, and I could see the acceptance in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing, that this wasn't a threat or an ultimatum. It was reality. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Tom. I never wanted this. Neither did I replied, feeling the finality of those words sink in. But it doesn't matter what we wanted. What matters is what you did. For the rest of the weekend, we barely spoke. The silence was thick, oppressive, filling the space between us with a heavy weight that words could never lift. By Sunday, I packed my things and drove home alone, leaving her behind to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. It was over, and for the first time in weeks, I felt free. Not happy, not whole, but free. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't yet have answers to. But I knew one thing for sure: I'd rebuild, piece by painful piece, and I wouldn't let her betrayal define the rest of my life. The months after I left Linda were a strange mix of emptiness and liberation. I'd moved out of our home into a small apartment nearby to stay close to the kids. They had taken the news hard, especially since neither of us had told them the full story. I figured they didn't need to know everything right now. All they knew was that Mom and Dad weren't together anymore, and I tried to be there for them as much as possible, filling the gaps Linda had left. I'd thrown myself into work, focusing on every project, taking every meeting, numbing myself with busyness. But there were still nights when I'd sit in the dark, looking around my small, unfamiliar space, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost pressed down on me. I knew I was still grieving, still trying to make sense of how everything had unraveled so quickly. It wasn't long before I heard that Linda's affair had fallen apart, barely a month after we'd separated. Her affair partner, as I'd suspected, wasn't interested in anything long-term. He'd moved on as soon as things became complicated, leaving her with the wreckage of our life. I'd like to say it gave me satisfaction, that I felt some sense of justice. But all I felt was sadness. Not for her, exactly, but for the life we'd once had, for the family that was now split. About 6 months after I'd moved out, I got a message from Linda. She wanted to meet, just to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in town, the kind of neutral ground that made everything feel safer, less personal. When she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thin, tired, as though the weight of her choices had drained her of something essential. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice small. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What's this about, Linda?" She looked down, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, her fingers pale against the ceramic. "I just wanted to apologize, again. I know I already said I'm sorry, but I don't think you'll ever understand how much I regret everything I did." I'd heard this before, but something in her tone felt different this time, less pleading, more resigned. "I know you regret it," I replied, my voice steady. "But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change what it did to our family." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know. And I'll carry that with me forever." She took a shaky breath, looking out the window. "I just wanted you to know that. I'm not expecting anything. I don't deserve anything from you, and I know that. But if you ever feel like there's a chance for us to be friends, or even just co-parents who can get along, I'd like that." I considered her words, feeling a flicker of something close to pity. I couldn't deny that a part of me still cared for her, still wanted her to find some peace, if only for the sake of the kids. I nodded, offering her a small, tight smile. "We'll take it one step at a time. For the kids." She smiled back, the faintest glimmer of hope lighting her eyes. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that wasn't entirely comfortable but wasn't unbearable either. When we finally said goodbye, I felt a strange sense of closure. I knew that I could move forward, that maybe someday I'd be able to forgive her, even if I couldn't forget. Over the next few months, Linda and I fell into a steady rhythm of co-parenting. She was careful around me, always making an effort to be civil, to avoid any hint of the tension that had once simmered between us. And gradually, I began to feel a kind of healing, a slow acceptance of the new life I was building. But life has a cruel way of surprising you just when you think you've finally found solid ground. One evening, I got a call from Linda's number, but when I answered, it wasn't her voice on the other end. It was a nurse from the local hospital. "Is this Tom?" the voice asked, calm but urgent. "Yes," I replied, a sense of dread creeping over me. "Is something wrong?" "Your wife, ex-wife, Linda has been in an accident. She was brought into the emergency room a few hours ago. I understand you're her emergency contact." My mind went blank, the words not fully sinking in. I'd barely considered that I was still her emergency contact, that in a situation like this, it would be me they called. I raced to the hospital, my heart pounding, my mind racing through scenarios, none of them good. When I arrived, a nurse directed me to a small waiting area. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, a doctor appeared, his expression somber. "Mr. Bennett?" he asked. "Yes," I managed, barely recognizing my own voice. "I'm sorry to inform you that your ex-wife sustained severe injuries. She was struck by a car while crossing the street. We did everything we could, but she didn't make it." I felt the floor drop out from under me. I stared at the doctor, his words washing over me like a wave of ice. This wasn't possible. It didn't feel real. Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded, his expression filled with the kind of sympathy that only comes from someone who's delivered news like this far too many times. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Bennett." The words echoed in my mind as I sank into a chair, numb and disoriented. My ex-wife, the woman who had shattered my heart, who had been a stranger to me for months, yet still somehow a part of me, was gone. Just like that. In the days that followed, I went through the motions, making arrangements, calling family, explaining things to the kids. Their grief was raw, and it tore at my heart to see them suffer in a way I couldn't fix. I tried to be strong, to hold them as they cried, to tell them that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. As I packed up Linda's belongings, I found reminders of our life together, a stack of old photo albums, birthday cards we'd given each other, even a crumpled note I'd written to her in college, tucked into the back of a drawer. It felt like a strange kind of punishment, having to confront the love we'd once shared, now twisted into a ghost of what could have been. One evening, while sorting through her things, I found a journal she'd kept. At first, I didn't want to read it, it felt invasive, like prying into something that wasn't meant for me. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it, flipping to the most recent entries. Her handwriting was shaky, the words rushed, as if she'd been trying to capture thoughts that eluded her. In one entry, written just a few weeks before the accident, she'd scrawled, "I miss him. I miss the way things were before I ruined everything. If I could go back, I would change it all. I'd tell him how much he means to me. I'd make him see that I still love him, that I always loved him." I read those words over and over, feeling the weight of her regret, her guilt, her love, a love that I hadn't been able to see, or maybe just refused to see, after everything that had happened. And in that moment, I felt a deep, hollow ache, a sadness that no amount of time or distance could heal. I'd moved on in the ways that mattered, and yet a part of me had held on, clinging to the idea that someday we'd find a way to be okay, that somehow we'd salvage something from the wreckage. But that hope was gone now, extinguished with her, leaving only an emptiness that echoed in the quiet of my apartment, in the silence of the nights that stretched on without her. In the end, Linda became a ghost, a haunting presence that lingered in the corners of my mind, reminding me of the life we'd shared, the love we'd lost, and the words that would forever remain unsaid.